Thank you for watching. Good evening. Over the last few months, during this program, we've had a number of guests who've spoken about corruption, and we've put together a brief feature to see what each one had to say.
As they started operating, although there had to be an investment of 178 million euros, this money never came true. And government, the Maltese government, had to guarantee a loan granted by Bank of Valletta to Vitals of 30 million. In the meantime, government was paying Ram Tumuluri, Vitals, every year 70 million euros. Presently, he is paying 90 million euros. And now, our corrupt Mr. Muscat, ex-Prime Minister of Malta, has gone to the incumbent Prime Minister Abela, and asked him that government should now pay stewards 120 million a year. Why are we paying this money to this consortium when they have not produced anything in the deal?
So they failed their obligations at law and contractual obligations. Conrad Mitzi, that's what was reported in newspapers locally, and there has never been a negation of that, actually signed a clause, an agreement, a restatement agreement, to pay them 100 million in cash when and if the contract is cancelled, even if that is cancelled due to their breaches. Their fault.
Right.
So just imagine.
Vitals left more than 36 million in debt from our taxes. They even sold the concession to stewards, as we know, before their 2-year contract elapsed. So basically, we can see a complex nature of Vitals without any experience, without any financial backup, running these 3 hospitals for 30 years for more than €1 billion over the term, and eventually nobody knows who these Vitals are.
In Malta, it turns out that the cops are the robbers, and the robbers are the robbers, and the cops go on holiday with the robbers. It's extraordinary what I've been reading. You know, and the number of leaks of the murder inquiry back to the people who there seems to be strong evidence that the people who actually commissioned the murder were kept informed of what was going on. For example, there's strong evidence that the 3 men who are accused of carrying out the murder, the 3 assassins, they deny it, but they were tipped off about when they were going to get arrested. Yes. And that's because of a leak, because the police inquiry was being leaked, it seems, through the Prime Minister's office. Yes. That's extraordinary. That's extraordinary.
I would like to also now start discussing what we're going to do after this. I think everybody on this island now can understand that this hospital contract was a mess, and that we have to now start thinking as to what we're going to do.
State impunity in its worst form. When we used to say that this is a mafia state, every day people are telling us, Therese, myself, the family, you were right. We thought you were exaggerating. We didn't think it was this bad. I mean, just today, without entering into detail what the people have followed from the media, Therese and myself were in the courtroom. You have the top brass of the country, the personal assistant of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister being privy to certain incriminating facts. Let's put it mildly. And we have this damning indictment by a person who turned state evidence, was given the presidential pardon, who basically is saying that this was the perfect conspiracy by a number of people to get rid of a person who was very much an inconvenience and a thorn in the neck for people who were corrupt.
The public inquiry is there to see if there was lack of action or bad action taken by any person in public office, be it a politician or be it the police commissioner or a police officer. So the inquiry is actually collecting evidence to try and see whether the police did their work on, for example, investigating the Panama scandal, the scandal that Daphne Caruana Galizia spoke to us about. Whether the police did their work on 17 Black.
Because it seems to me to be a high priority for Malta to show a genuine desire to do something about all these things, or face very negative financial, economic consequences, as well as the brain drain.
Political appointments, whether it be in Europe, the United States, or Asia, are notorious for being friends of friends and more social networking rather than actual professional appointees. And this is a big problem.
Former head of the Economic Crime Unit, Ian Abdullah, accepted the Attorney General's nod and a wink to go slow investigating Conrad Mitzi and Keith Kembry. They'll now come out and say, but he never said that, and the AG is actually saying, but I never said that. But frankly, I think it's very clear. The Economic Crime Unit was told, listen, slow down, be careful, be very, very sure you know what you're doing, etc., which to anybody who speaks police means lay off, be good. The second thing which struck me, though, was the sheer hypocrisy of our Prime Minister. He met questions, he rebutted questions from journalists about which minister had relations with that, sorry, I'm quoting Bill Clinton here, didn't have relations with anyone, etc., and which minister was too close, and which junior minister did this and did that, whatever, by saying, listen, you can only criticize them if they had these relationships, whatever they were, the sexual drinking buddies or whatever, I really don't care, after he was charged with the murder or involved in the murder accusations of Daphne Caruana Galizia.
The first thing that the Chief of Staff of the Prime Minister did upon being appointed to the Prime Minister was to open a company in Panama and to have the shares of that company in Panama held by a trust in New Zealand. And one may ask, what interest does the Chief of Staff of a Prime Minister who has just been swept to power after 25 years in opposition have in opening a company in Panama literally a few months after his appointment? But he wasn't alone in doing that. The most important minister in the cabinet of the Prime Minister was the minister responsible for energy, Conrad Mitzi, did the same thing, identical to the Chief of Staff.
These deals are not above board. They look very problematic. Of course, that's the reading I've done. I'm not acting for anybody. I would have to do a proper due diligence and review this. But linking procurement and concessions and everything and conflict of interest, it just fails every tick box of proper, a proper acquisition. I think the government could not do worse in losing public trust.
That was a clip with various guests we've hosted during this program who have spoken on corruption. Should you have any queries, any comments, please do direct them to Net Television or directly to me, anonymously if you wish, via my blogs, and we'll address them during this program. My next guest is somebody who's appeared regularly. Professor Colin Lawrence joins us from London. He is a risk expert and an expert also on good governance. Good evening, Colin. How are you?
Hi, Leah. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thank you for joining us once again. I wanted to refer today to international trade. When a country such as ours, such as Malta, seems to be participating in trade and various procurement and contracts with countries who are reputed to be corrupt. I mean, we've seen Azerbaijan, we've seen Montenegro, Angola's come up in the press this week. What damage does that do to the country?
Leah, as I said before, and listening to your clips and the discussions I've had with you, it does immense damage because the international investment community will lose trust or already lost trust. So it's absolutely vital, as we've said before, to stamp all of this out. I mean, when we look at the two major transactions, the medical transaction, the Vitals transaction, and the oil transaction with the Azaris, you look at that whole picture, the actual structure are very, very similar. It's getting offshore funding, setting up companies, linking government, and so on. And that's the reason why the Azaris have been accused in Forbes magazine of transferring monies into European banks in order to bribe officials. So right now, Malta are at the center, call it the epicenter of this money laundering. And I think that it has to be really brought under control. Otherwise, people will lose confidence in any investment into Malta.
What are your thoughts? We've discussed this many times, Colin, but each week in the press, obviously I work off information on the public domain, information that has been published already. We see this week another story that's come up on Angola and investments that have been done via Malta. What does that do to our country? How do other countries see us? And would they be willing to do the same trade that they would have done, let's say, 10 years ago?
I can't speak for all the companies, but clearly one gets a downgrade. I mean, you know, the Council of Europe have already warned, you keep getting these alerts, assassination, companies that are part of a money laundering scheme. So obviously it hurts international trade. I mean, and it's what I've told you, and it's all the tie-ins with certain emerging markets. You know, so people, you know, Malta then becomes a laughing stock of the international community for doing fair, proper, honest trade with a high integrity.
Sure. And what does that do to local businesses eventually? Because we've obviously perhaps started seeing some changes, but nothing that has hurt very badly yet.
Well, in banks, you get a credit rating, and there also will be a sovereign risk credit rating. And Malta already once on the watch list, as you saw in Moneyval, will just get downgraded ultimately, and banks will revise their scores. I can't say that I'm right there making these decisions in banks, but one would have to look at this very, very carefully in doing business with banks. And I fear that the European Central Bank and the SSM are actually going to be concerned, given you've had a number of closures now of banks, whereas you've had warnings for years that there's corrupt money going on into these banks. So that really hurts the people of Malta. And what I suggested the last time is you need a solution to solve this. One solution, I mean, just thinking about these deals, is that any government official should not be allowed to own any financial interest, okay? It's got to be taken out. The United States has some of these rules, and they've been violated recently, and it's led to all sorts of investigations. But it's the linkage between government and between private investors and international investors that aren't clean. And I think it's got to be cleaned up. So you need a whole set of rules. You need legal tools, criminal tools. Banks need to be forewarned with capital charges. They need to have tools for surveillance of money laundering. And you should have strong rules against taking of money, particularly by public officials. What we've seen from all the cases happening, you know, Daphne Galizia, that's exactly what she was doing. She was doing the investigation, not your internal audit department. Only later on did they start doing it. But as I look down, you know, you've had banks with issues, and the FIAU have given them a clean bill of health in the part. So it just says that there isn't good governance in your regulatory bodies. That's got to be very heavily strengthened.
Just to conclude for today, Colin, a topic again that we've spoken about very briefly. There seems to be a trend here for the use of cryptocurrencies. Is that a good idea to pursue that once we're in this sort of state right now?
I think definitely not. I mean, I would stay away from, you have to use things like blockchain as a technology for operations and accounting systems. But once you start using cryptocurrency and everything, you know, this could go in the dark cloud. You at the moment have got to sort out basics. And until you sort out all these basics, which we've discussed, okay, I feel that it would lead to a higher risk for the country. You've got to have a clean bill of health before you can pursue that.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Lawrence.
A pleasure.
Thank you.
Bye, Leah.
Bye-bye. That was Professor Colin Lawrence, former director of the Bank of England, and he actually supervised all the banks and building societies in the UK, based in London. We're joined by our next guest, again somebody you've seen very often, and we're just going to conclude our program today. Professor Nikos Passas from the USA is with us now. Thank you once again for joining us once again. You've really explored whatever is happening here, and I know you've kept up with your reading and whatever is developed in the press over the last week. We spoke to you last week. To conclude, what are your thoughts on the new developments that have emerged this week?
Well, with every new development, it's gradually becoming a case study for corruption for classes in universities around the world, and confirm every week what Daphne said, that there are crooks everywhere you look. So at some point, scandals, impunity, and lack of responsiveness from the government reach a boiling point, and the people of Malta are going to demand some effective reform. The lack of the problematic governance and the way in which Malta is infested with crime and has become a conduit for serious crime, for other crimes, therefore having an impact on other countries, is completely unsustainable and is going to have an impact both on the economy and the people of Malta. So the need for reform is urgent, and trust is in short supply in crises like COVID. So the question is, how do you restore this? And how do you do it in a way that is credible both domestically and internationally? And in an ideal world, the ideal situation would be to have a Maltese solution for the Maltese problems. And the challenges there, however, are A, that we have not seen a genuine political will up to now. 2, the problems affect people both in government and in opposition. And 3, the legal system in Malta is extremely slow. Therefore, a solution has to be sought in a way that combines internal and external assistance and support. So the Maltese people have to devise a mechanism to do essentially three things. First, establish the facts, because it is no good to simply have allegations back and forth and uncertainty about what actually happened. So first, establish the facts. Secondly, do justice, accountability, repatriate the assets and repair the damage to the victims. And three, fix the system, come up with a strategy for a holistic reform where everyone is going to be involved. If that doesn't happen, I'm afraid the crisis is going to get far worse and irreversible.
And how much worse can it get?
Well, it gets worse when people stop investing, when people stop doing business, and when people think that this is not a good idea to go and have holiday there because I'm supporting a corrupt system. So at that point, all interests that are vested in silence and in non-responsiveness are going to be muted, and the self-interests also of those involved are going to be affected. But ultimately, it will have to be the Maltese people who do something about it. And it does take, in fact, some leadership and someone who will be able to articulate this so that you can have a coherent strategic response to this. Because in bits and pieces, piecemeal approaches really are irreversible and unsuccessful ultimately.
How long, in your opinion, does it take for the repercussions to be felt by the man in the street, you know, normal citizens?
Well, it's hard to isolate factors right now because we have a pandemic crisis that is having seriously negative consequences on the economy as well. This is the time where, in fact, confidence in institutions and international cooperation is even more important. Imagine if you have a situation where you do not trust your government, you do not trust the authorities, others do not trust you, and you are left alone dealing with a pandemic. You don't want to do that, and you do not want to be in a small jurisdiction where you do have a lot of reliance on international fund flows, international trade, and tourism. If those spigots of energy and well-being are closed off, then you're going to have unrest and discontent within the country as well. But there is also the question of justice. There is the question of rule of law. And it is no longer a question of simply for Malta. It's affecting multiple other jurisdictions. You look at the Baltics, you look at Libya, you look at Europe, you look at, it's a problem that is right in your face in the middle of the Mediterranean. So something needs to be done also for the rule of law and for justice. So it is either a lose-lose outcome or a win-win outcome. And I hope that the Maltese people and its leaders are going to find the political will and the means on their own and with assistance from outside to actually do something effective about it. But it has to be something that moves the needle. It has to be something that is based on the facts and not on simple theories, allegations, and therefore perpetuating the kind of antagonistic atmosphere that dominates in what one reads at least about the handling of the crisis in Malta right now.
Thank you very much, Professor Passas. Thank you once again. That was Professor Nikos Passas, an anti-corruption specialist, a criminal lawyer, and a specialist in criminal justice. I didn't like something that he mentioned today. He did say that Malta was being used as a case study for corruption in all universities around the world, and that's not something very nice, I think. However, as I said, Should you have any queries, please direct them to Net Television or myself. And I thank you once again for joining me. I'll see you next week at the same time. I wish you a lovely weekend. Good night.